Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our attendees joining us today for this latest Data Science Central webinar. This is Bill Voorhees, your host. I'm the editorial director with Data Science Central and also chief data scientist for Data Magnum. I'd like to start off our event today by thanking Tableau for sponsoring today's event. Tableau is a longtime supporter of the Data Science Central community, and we're honored to have them sponsoring our event today. I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention and show our appreciation for some of our other recent sponsors, including Pivotal, Microsoft, Oracle, IBM, and Teradata, to name just a few. You know, past webinars are available on demand at datasciencecentral.com, and if you haven't had an opportunity to view them, I encourage you to take a look. They provide some very useful insight into a wide variety of topics of interest to our data science community. Today's webinar is entitled 100 Years of Data Visualization. It's time to stop making the same mistakes. So before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format for today's webinar. Today's webinar will be an hour long. We'll have one panelist who I'll introduce in just a minute. There'll be a 10 to 15 minute QA following the presentation, and this event is being recorded and will be available on datasciencecentral.com later this afternoon following today's live event. I'd also like to encourage our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation. We'll be reviewing and presenting them on your behalf during the QA portion of today's event. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Andy Cotgreave of Tableau. Andy is a senior consultant at Tableau. And prior to that, he was senior data analyst at the University of Oxford. In this current role, he helps new customers solve problems and develops and teaches training courses that focus on data visualization best practices. And as someone who simply loves numbers, you can find him at data-related conferences, popping up as the author of free public data visualizations, or anywhere else there's data and questions to be answered. Thanks for being with us today, Andy. We're looking forward to your presentation. In 1914, New Yorker Willard Brinton wrote Graphic Methods for Presenting Facts, the first book on telling stories through data and communicating information visually. Today, the volume of data in the world is exponentially increasing, and the tools to transform analysis into storytelling are evolving. And 100 years later, Brinton's lessons still hold true. So in today's live DSC webinar, we'll explore visualization basics that withstand the test of time, the right charts for telling the right stories, and Brinton's checklist for commuting data. Andy, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can begin as soon as you're ready to go.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you, everybody, for attending today. Great to be part of the Data Science Central webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about things from 100 years ago. I'm going to start off with a quote. Millions of dollars yearly are spent in the collection of data with the fond expectation that the data will automatically cause the correction of the conditions studied. Millions of dollars of data being spent yearly. That is something that could have been written in 2015, but no, it was written by Willard Cope Brinton 101 years ago. Now, isn't it strange that a sentence written on page 1 of an incredible book that's 100 years old could have been transported to 2015? Why has nothing changed? Is it the fault of customers and companies and organizations? Is it the fault of the vendors like Tableau for not getting this right? Well, that's a really interesting question, which we're going to try and explore throughout the next 45 minutes. I have two objectives for the next 45 minutes. Three, actually. The first one is, as we said, to give you a couple of ideas of some of the data visualization guidelines that have stood the test of time. Through that objective, I want you all to leave here with an understanding of who Brinton was. Because this book that he wrote 101 years ago could sit on your desk now and still be as valid a guide to data visualization as any of the books that have been published in the last 20 years. The second objective is to give you a sense of, a sense of calm and a sense of zen, in that while what Brinton was trying to solve, the problems we're trying to solve today, that there are things we can solve and we can change our practices and improve the way we do things. But there are other things that, it's always going to be a problem. 100 years ago, there was too much data and not enough technology to solve the problems. 100 years later, today, there's still too much technology and too much data to kind of get through all the data-related challenges we need to today. So I want you to take away some data visualization lessons, really get an appreciation of this unknown guy, Brinton, and then realize that even if everything was perfect 100 years later today, we've still got hurdles that we're always going to overcome. So let me take you back to 1914, a time when people were busy commuting to work, busy working hard, kind of just like today. This is a picture of Liverpool Street in London, which is, you can probably tell I'm based in the UK. Busy, grimy, kind of hassle in the commutes, kind of like my daily commute to London. 100 years ago, the working environment was also going through big transitions. This is a photograph from the National Bank of Scotland, its offices in London. You can see standing desks were all the rage, an echo or a cycle that's come around again, as we now seem to be using standing desks an awful lot. But life 100 years ago in these offices was pretty hard, pretty busy, and pretty data-driven. In the late 19th century, companies had started using tables to communicate data. This is a table of data from the railroads. They were the pioneers of tabulated data. It seemed like a revolution at the time. And typewriter companies had the revolution of saying, let's put a tab key onto a typewriter. Some of you will have used the tab key to physically move carriages along on a piece of paper. Others of you in the audience probably think a tab key is just what you use to move your cursor from one text box to another in a web form. That's often the way I determine the age of my audience, depending on which way you know your tab keys. But let it be known that 1914 was an age of an explosion of big data. From handwritten daily reports that were getting collated to punch cards, an absolute revolution in data collection and analysis. And if you had the Hollerith tabulating machine for totaling the data contained on punch cards, then you too could process 3,000 records per hour. How amazing would that have been? Now, I'm sure my smartphone has processed more than 3,000 records since I probably started this talk. But it was an age of big data. We've always been in this things like 3,000 records. That's amazing. What can I do with 3,000 records of data? Now it's 3 million records or 3 billion records of data. What can I do with those? We're still in a period of having more data than we know what to do with. And if you were the chap on the right processing this machine, then that was really amazing. And in fact, this guy is Hollerith himself, who went on to create the founding company that became IBM. So Hollerith himself led to the organizations and the industry that became where we are today in 2015. 1914 is also an amazing period, and the book, Brinton's book, which I'll talk specifically about the book, but one thing about Brinton's book is about the revelations about society that Brinton talks about. And this is a sentence from the book: the punching is usually done by girls. What on earth was he talking about? Well, he wasn't talking about boxing. I use this sentence to show a reflection of what society was like in 1914. In the book itself, Brinton mentions men or man about 200-300 times. He uses the word woman not a single time, and he uses the word girl 7 or 8 times. Brinton's world was very much a man's world where men run businesses and men do the work, and in Brinton's example, girls do the card punching. So even though Brinton was ahead of his time, in the book we're about to examine, he was also possibly, he was a reflector of society at the time, kind of misogynistic. Unfortunately, we're on our way to equality. What I love about Brinton is that he also didn't hold his punches back. And so I'm going to show you a quote, my favorite quote from the book, and maybe some people in the audience can relate to the challenges you all face as analysts. Brinton said, "There is danger in giving too much information to executives of small brain capacity." Possibly some of you relate to those issues. If you are an executive listening to this webinar, I'm sure you've got a huge brain capacity. But within that sentence, Brinton actually was making a really good point. Our job as analysts, our job as people trying to communicate data to other people, is about giving people who have, let's say they have too little time, trying to give them information which is concise and well communicated so that those people can consume the data very, very quickly. Now, let's have a quick look at who Brinton was. Why was he motivated to write this book? You know what I've just realized? The book, I haven't told you what the book is called. The book is called Graphic Methods for Presenting Facts. And it was printed in 1914. And it was the first book about data visualization, about effective data visualization. And it was written by Brinton. He was an inventor living in New York and working at this building on 11th Avenue, which is still there today. And as well as getting loads of patents and, being a really, really clever engineer, he wrote this book. And he was motivated to solve the problems of the day because just like in 2015, he was seeing people making all sorts of charting errors. Even within the fact that, even though what we do today and what we did then was share a motivation to share data and to be expressive and to get the data right. If I talk first about sharing the data, what do we do now? Well, now we just publish something to the internet or publish something on our corporate server, and anybody with a logon can see or access to the internet can see the data. People wanted to share in 1914 too, but they had to do it in different ways. This is a photograph from the book of a municipal parade in New York. It looks like it's pouring down with rain, and yet people are still out there. And what's on the back of that horse and cart is a chart about the municipal spending of data on health and welfare and education and things like that. People wanted to share data. Could you imagine printing your chart on a massive chart, putting it on a cart and getting a man with a horse to drive that thing? Well, if you are motivated to share your data, you will come up with those innovations. Brinton also recognized and wanted to encourage expressiveness. Here are two examples, both of which we'll look at in a little while. One, a map showing transit volumes in Frankfurt, another showing the explosion of people on the railroad. Another contemporary issue, particularly if you live in the southeast of the UK. But we'll look at both of those later. But his prime motivation was, yes, you want to share, yes, you want to be expressive, but just like today, you want to be effective. And I show you these two charts because already Brinton was full of examples of ways not to visualize data. You can see that the one on the left is figure 3. This was on the second page of the book. And he was like, we have to stop people doing terrible circular charts. They hadn't called them pie charts back then. Because he knew pie charts and radar charts were not effective ways of showing data. As we'll see, Brinton was very much binary. It's like rules, whereas today I'd be like, yeah, guidelines. There are times when a pie chart works. This pie chart's pretty cool. It shows family income and how much people spent on food. Apparently you spent $400 a year on food and a whopping $171.61 a year on rent. So some things certainly have changed between now and 1914. Prices have, if not the preponderance of pie charts. I'm not going to do the pop quiz. Right, so Brinton had written this book, and he was motivated to stop people making bad charts. And what I want to do now for the rest of really for the focus of the rest of the session is focus on the book itself and what we can take from the book today. And I'm going to do that into two sections. The first section, I'm just going to show some innovations that Brinton came up with to really drive home the fact that this guy, 100 years ago, was coming up with amazing ideas, just like people in the field are today. And so I want to show two examples of innovation and then do three concrete examples of best practice that you can put into the charts you maybe are making straight after this webinar. The book's about 350 pages long, and believe me, it's a really amazing read. It's an amazing read just from a historical point of view, but it's also an amazing read from a data viz practitioner's point of view. And you will learn about data visualization by reading this book. I've only got time to show you two examples of innovation and four things about best practice from the book. You'll notice that at the bottom of every slide there is a URL. And if you go to that URL, it's case sensitive, then you can find, I've taken loads of excerpts from the book to give many more examples than I can fit into this webinar. There's also a link there to go and read the actual book online. My first example of innovation is around interactivity. In 2015, interactivity with visualization tools is as easy as dragging and dropping things around in a canvas. What I'm showing here is just screenshots of Tableau. If people aren't familiar with Tableau, this is what Tableau Desktop looks like. And you can change these charts literally just by dragging and dropping dimensions and measures around. You're interacting with the data and you're seeing changes as quick as you can think of questions to ask and as quick as you can move your mouse. It's an absolute revelation, and now we have this ability to change charts instantly. It seems, well, that's amazing, and what a great innovation. Thank God we're there in 2015. Well, Brinton recognized 100 years ago that actually interactivity is really, really amazing. He didn't have the benefit of technology, screens and mouses and amazing programmers and very intelligent people who could program their computers, but he did have index cards. And he suggested that instead of just doing big charts on big posters, what you should do is do one period of each measure. Break up your big line charts into smaller periods. So on an index card, as you're seeing here, he's showing just sales, so just a single measure for a single year for a single product. And what this means is once you've got these index cards filed, you could take three of them out and say, well, give me sales of 19, 10, 11, and 12. We can put these index cards on the table on top of each other like this to show a kind of seasonality view. Or you can put them side by side. And when you put them side by side, you actually see a view of the time over, the entire time series, and you can see when the highest and lowest parts of the period were. And you could take sales measures, you could take a bit of profit measures, and really start mixing and matching these index cards to come up with interactivity. Brinton had realized that interactivity was the key, and he came up with this incredible filing system methodology that enabled businesses to do that. He was trying to solve the problems we are able to solve with that today. The good news is that even a man of ordinary mental caliber can do it. So there's hope for us all. And he had a whole chapter devoted to that filing system. I have not been able to find out how many businesses successfully adopted it, but it's an amazing idea. A second example of innovation, something that we can actually apply to charts we design today, is around isotype. So here's a chart that Brinton redrew. This was a redrawing of an existing chart. It shows that the number of passengers between 1899 and 1911 was exploding. It more than doubled. And Brinton recognized the inherent tension in all data visualization. On the one hand, the charts we make need to be functional. You need to actually be able to look at the marks that represent the data and interpret what it's saying accurately. But at the same time, your charts need to be engaging. Because if all you do is just bar charts, then sometimes that's just a bit boring in business. And the tension in data visualization is always balancing functionality with with beauty to create engagement. And Brinton said, well, instead of just drawing an icon and making it bigger or smaller, and that's really bad, as we'll see in a minute, why not repeat the icons? And that was his chart, 1914. It seemed like a good idea. I choose this as an example of innovation because here is a chart from 1930. It looks very similar. It's all about home and factory weaving in England in the 19th century. This was created by Otto Neurath and his friends in Germany in the 1930s. Otto Neurath was a leading graphic designer who came up with this idea of graphic design and using little icons to represent data. Fast forward, and in design circles, Otto Neurath is the man credited with creating this system, and he called it isotype, and it's used in design extensively today. Well, that was 1930, but this chart was in 1914. What happened there? How come Brinton isn't the father of isotype? And in fact, when they went and looked at Otto Neurath's library, he had a copy of Brinton's book in his library. So it seems to me fair to say that Brinton's idea about making engaging charts using icons led to Otto Neurath's creation of the isotype. So I'm trying to put Brinton on a pedestal because he was motivated, just like we all are today, to make effective use of data. And he was also a really intelligent guy who came up with loads of great ideas. What are those ideas? Well, I'm going to show 4 specific ideas of how to make charts effective. Again, and these are really the lessons you could take away today to improve your charts or maybe make sensible chart choices. The first of which is don't size by area. This is the annual commerce of the world, drawn in circles that get bigger over time. So we've got data from 1850 to 1910. And Brinton was like, this is a disaster. I can't actually compare values. And he was making the point, often made in textbooks today, is that area is a really bad way of visualizing data. Not that it's bad per se, it's just that we actually aren't very good at perceiving the relative changes between areas. He used optical illusions to illustrate it, and I'm going to illustrate that example with a modern version. This chart is from The Economist from August last year, and it shows deaths per day of in Ebola-affected countries. And the point of the article that went with this was that, well, Ebola is really bad, but there are still really big diseases killing more people. So I've taken the numbers out for now, except the one in the circle at the top. Ebola, that circle at the top, the number 4, shows that 4 deaths per day in the countries. And that circle represents 4. So what is the number that is behind the question mark for diarrhea? How many deaths per day were there for diarrhea? I'm sure you're all shouting your answer at the screen. Well, the answer is 404. What most people answer, when I ask this question, most people answer, about 100, maybe 150. No, that diarrhea circle is actually 400 times bigger than the Ebola circle. And so when we look at all the values, we see that HIV and AIDS are 685 deaths per day. So the problem here is, when you size by area, it's quite easy for us to see the differences between area in big circles and small circles, but we're very, very poor at working out the precise differences. And if the two circles are similar sizes, it's actually quite hard to see the exact difference. Sometimes it's hard to see which is bigger and which is smaller. And so Brinton made this example many times in the book. This World Trade one was one example, and he redrew this chart as a line chart. You can see in the line chart that actually it's a lot easier to see the rate of growth when growth got bigger, when growth was faster and slower, and it's a lot easier to compare very accurately the differences between different periods. Don't size by area, said Brinton. I did the same. I redrew the Ebola chart using a bar chart. And here's the thing. You know, my bar chart shows the differences in the numbers very, very easily, or much more effectively than the circles. Is it a better chart? Brinton would definitely say so. But yeah, the Economist has different editorial reasons and different motivations for doing its charts. And you know, I personally would never say never about making any kind of chart. There are always reasons to use different kinds of charts and breaks and rules. But generally, I agree with Brinton. Do not size by area. Best practice number 2 is to start your axes at 0. This is a chart showing egg prices in the US from 1909 to 1912. You may think egg prices are not a big issue, but as I was preparing this talk a couple of months ago for the first time, I found this headline on the Guardian news site. Netherlands to save US after bird flu outbreak by sending egg products. Yes, egg prices are an issue even 100 years later. And I love this headline because apparently without the egg products, I don't know what would have happened to the US. If the Netherlands hadn't saved you, what would have happened if you didn't have those egg products? I don't know. But just like today, 100 years ago, the egg prices were an issue. And Brinton's issue here was, you know what? This chart makes it look like the prices went to near 0. And, of course, they didn't. It's the fact that it's the y-axis that starts at 60 rather than at 0 on the left-hand side. Brinton, oh man, he really, really stuck with this rule. He had countless examples of charts about wages, about flood rises, and all sorts of things showing any time I see an axis that doesn't start at 0, well, he got cross. And let's look at a modern example of how that can work and when that might hold true. So was he right? Should I always start my axes at 0? For this example, I want to use Usain Bolt, fastest sprinter in the world. He smashed the record for the 100 meters 6 years ago, and The Guardian produced a chart where the axis did not start at 0. So here's the data with Brinton's rule being adhered to. That's the change in the 100-meter world record from 1910 to 2010, and it's boring. Not only is it boring, you can't actually see the real impact Usain Bolt had. Also, it's not really very good design because there's a lot of white space. And part of effective communication is also just doing good design. Now, if we break Brinton's rule and start the axis at 9.5 seconds, we have a much more interesting chart. The relative change is what's important, and the impact of Usain Bolt's amazing athletic prowess is there for all to see. You can see that line is so steep there. It's steeper at any time in history. It's also a massive